Close your eyes if you want to. You do not need to be watching. You just need to be here, somewhere quiet, somewhere the world outside cannot reach you for a little while. Maybe you are in bed. Maybe you are on a couch with the lights low. Maybe you are somewhere in between, half in the day and half out of it. Wherever you are, stay there. Let your breathing slow down until it is the only sound you are aware of, that soft rise and fall that has been carrying you through every day of your life without ever asking for your attention. Let it have your attention now. The world of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of the most beautiful fictional worlds ever imagined. 4 nations, 4 elements, a cycle of reincarnated peacekeepers, a sky full of bison and dragons, and the slow turn of seasons across landscapes that feel like places you have been even though you have never been anywhere near them. If you watched it as a child, you probably remember it as warm, the colors bright, the humor easy, the friendships real in the specific way that only certain stories manage to make friendship feel real, like it matters, like the people involved in it are worth caring about beyond the borders of the screen. But underneath all of that warmth, underneath every scene of Aang gliding on open air and Katara bending water into shapes like long silver ribbons against a blue sky, there is another story, an older story, a heavier story. A story that Avatar tells in fragments and silences and background details and character behaviors that most viewers absorb without fully articulating what they have absorbed. A story about what 100 years of continuous, systematic, generational war actually does to a world, and to the people living inside it. Tonight, we are going to sit with that story, not the adventure, not the bending or the humor or the arc of a 12-year-old boy learning to carry the weight of every life that has ever been lived in the skin he wears. Those things are real and worth celebrating. But there is something in the dark architecture of Avatar, The Last Airbender, that deserves its own space, its own attention, its own slow hour in the quiet. The things that live underneath the surface of the show, the lore that most conversations rush past on the way to celebrating Zuko's redemption or debating Aang's pacifism. The 100-Year War is not a backdrop. It is the engine of every single thing that happens in Avatar, The Last Airbender. Every character in the show is who they are because of the 100-Year War. Katara lost her mother to it. Sokka grew up with his father gone to fight it. Aang was its first and most total casualty, losing not just his people but the entire civilization that produced him. Zuko was marked by his father's participation in it and then spent 3 seasons trying to decide which side of the mark to live on. Toph was sheltered from it in ways that shaped her isolation as much as any battle shaped the people who fought and won. Even Iroh, who was once one of its architects, became who he is now because of the specific grief that the war delivered directly to his door. And it is worth understanding what the war actually was before you understand what the war did to everyone inside it. Because the show gives you the consequences of the war in real time through 61 episodes of present-tense drama, but the cause of the war, the full historical weight of what set a century of violence in motion, lives in the margins, in the flashbacks and the backstory fragments and the careful architecture of what the show chooses to show you and what it trusts you to infer. Before the comet, before the genocide, before the 100 years began, the 4 nations of the Avatar world existed in a balance that was imperfect the way all balances are imperfect, maintained not by the absence of tension, but by the presence of enough connection and mutual respect that the tensions did not escalate beyond what could be managed. The air nomads maintained their temples at the 4 corners of the world, in cliffside structures that clung to the sides of mountains the way certain kinds of wisdom cling to things, with lightness, without gripping. Their monks were vegetarians and wanderers and practitioners of a spiritual philosophy that placed non-attachment at its center. They did not believe in holding on to things, to places, to possessions, to the specific form that life takes at any given moment. The world changes. The element they bent, the air itself, does not resist change. It moves with change, around change, through change. Aang grew up inside this philosophy. He was identified as the Avatar at 7, earlier than any Avatar before him, and the monks began his formal Avatar training in a way that he found difficult not because of the bending, but because of the separation it required. They wanted to isolate him from attachments, specifically from Gyatso, his teacher, the monk who beat everyone at airball and laughed when he did it, the man who snuck Aang extra pastries and taught him that the world was worth laughing in. The monks were not wrong, exactly, about the danger of attachment for an Avatar who needed to be present to every nation equally. But they were not entirely right either, and the tension between the philosophy and the boy who could not help feeling things too strongly for a non-attachment tradition to fully contain was still unresolved the night Aang ran. The Northern Water Tribe, by the time the war began, had built something genuinely extraordinary. A city of ice and canal that took the geographic logic of Venice and reimagined it in sheets of frozen water, and the architectural intuition of a culture that had been building in extreme conditions for generations. The city was enormous and intricate, fed by the spiritual oasis at its center where the moon and ocean spirits swam as koi fish, in a circle that was also a yin-yang symbol made of living creatures. The Northern Water Tribe had waterbending masters of formidable skill and a spiritual connection to their element that was as deep as any in the world. The Southern Water Tribe was smaller, more pragmatic, shaped by the specific demands of the vast frozen continent at the bottom of the world. Hunters and healers and waterbenders who used their element in ways the North had formalized into a martial art, and the South had kept practical. Two tribes, same element, different relationships to it, both thriving in their own ways before the war changed everything. The Earth Kingdom was ancient and enormous and complicated the way all ancient enormous things are complicated. It contained within it jungles and deserts and mountains, and the specific contradiction of being the most geographically diverse nation, while also being the most politically rigid, the one most invested in maintaining the structures that had organized it for centuries. Ba Sing Se had stood behind its walls since before the war, and would stand behind them after, and inside those walls, ordinary people went about ordinary lives with the ordinary gravity of people who do not yet know that something enormous is coming toward them from across the sea. And the Fire Nation, before the war, was not a villain's origin story. The Fire Nation had culture, art, history, a relationship with its element that was not inherently destructive. Fire is the element of power, of passion, of drive. The Fire Nation's people were not born wrong. Their traditions were not fundamentally broken. They were simply people who lived on a chain of volcanic islands in a warm sea, who bent fire because fire was what their islands offered them, who built their cities in the architectural language of Southeast Asian and Japanese temple design, because those were the real-world traditions the show drew from for their culture. Before the war, the Fire Nation was just a place. This is the most important thing to understand, before anything else. The 100-Year War was not caused by a nation that was always evil. It was caused by a specific man who made a specific choice, and then made another, and then made another, each choice following from the one before it with the terrible logical inevitability of something that feels, in retrospect, as though it could not have been otherwise, but which was, at every step, a choice. A man who looked at what his nation had and decided the rest of the world deserved to have it too, and who was willing to make the rest of the world take it whether it wanted to or not. That is where the 100 years begins. Not in some ancient malevolence, in ambition, in the sincere belief that one nation's prosperity is a gift to be spread rather than a condition to be admired from a distance. In the specific kind of pride that looks at what it has built and concludes that building it everywhere else is a moral obligation. The damage this belief caused accumulated slowly at first and then faster, the way damage always accumulates. One colony planted in Earth Kingdom territory. One avatar who confronted the Fire Lord and told him to stop. One confrontation that turned a friendship into a silence. One volcano on a remote island. One choice made in a moment of recognition that the obstacle was gone. And then the comet. And then the dawn attack. And then the ash. Before we go any further, if you are watching this somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. There is something I find genuinely moving about knowing that someone is listening to these words in a city I have never visited, at an hour when most of the people around them are asleep. Tell me where you are. Tell me what the night looks like from where you are sitting. And if you have not subscribed yet, that is how you make sure the next one finds you when it arrives. Section 2. Sozin and Roku, the friendship that broke the world. There is a specific kind of tragedy that Avatar, the Last Airbender, understands more precisely than most stories ever manage to articulate. It is not the tragedy of monsters. Monsters are easy. You can point at them, name them, explain why their monstrousness is exceptional and therefore not a model for anything else. The tragedy of Avatar is harder than that. It is the tragedy of men who were once boys, who shared birthdays and played together and looked out at the same horizon from the same vantage point, and who grew up into different people, shaped by different pressures and different powers, and different degrees of being told by the world that they were exceptional, and who became, because of all of this, something to each other that neither of them could have predicted on the day they celebrated turning 16 in the palace courtyard, with everyone they knew watching. Fire Lord Sozin and Avatar Roku were born on the same day. They grew up together in the Fire Nation Palace as princes, as companions, as something that the show carefully does not romanticize but which it also does not dismiss. They were genuinely close. The flashbacks that Roku narrates in Book 3's 6th episode, The Avatar and the Fire Lord, are filled with the specific texture of a real friendship, the jokes and the shared experiences, and the way that knowing someone since childhood creates a kind of familiarity that no adult relationship can replicate because it is built on the foundation of having been young together in the same place. When Roku's identity as the Avatar was revealed, on the day of their shared birthday, the celebration became something else. Roku had to leave. He had to spend 12 years traveling the world learning to master all 4 elements, 12 years away from the Fire Nation and everyone in it. He did not choose this. It was the consequence of being born into the Avatar cycle, of carrying the soul that would be called into service whether or not the person carrying it wanted to be called. He said goodbye to Sozin, and Sozin, who would become Fire Lord in Roku's absence, watched his friend leave. 12 years is a long time. Long enough for Sozin to become someone different from the boy who shared a birthday with the Avatar. Long enough to grow into the power of the Fire Lord's throne, to see his nation's wealth and military strength from the vantage point of the person responsible for directing both. And what Sozin saw from that vantage point was prosperity. Real prosperity, genuine material success, the visible evidence of a society that had developed and grown and built things that worked. What he also saw, looking outward from the edges of that prosperity, was the rest of the world, which seemed to him to be struggling in ways that the Fire Nation was not. The vision Sozin developed, the vision that would eventually destroy everything he claimed to value, was not nihilistic. It was not born of hatred. He wanted to share what the Fire Nation had. He said this to Roku directly when Roku finally returned, a fully realized avatar, changed by 12 years of traveling the world and mastering its elements. He said it with the warmth of someone who genuinely believed that what he was proposing was generous, that offering the world the benefit of the Fire Nation's development and culture and methods was an act of abundance rather than an act of imposition. Roku understood immediately what this meant, because Roku had spent 12 years inside every other nation's way of being. He had trained in the Earth Kingdom and learned earthbending from an old master who showed him that stability and endurance were their own forms of power. He had trained with the Water Tribe and learned that redirection, the willingness to yield to a force in order to redirect it, was not weakness but sophistication. He had trained with airbenders and learned that the absence of resistance was sometimes the most effective resistance. He had been made, by his training, into a person who could hold all 4 nations inside himself simultaneously, and from that vantage point, Sozin's vision of sharing looked exactly like what it was: occupation with a philosophical justification. Roku did not equivocate. He went to a new Fire Nation colony that Sozin had established in Earth Kingdom territory, a colony built without permission, without negotiation, without any consideration for the people whose land it was built on, and he destroyed it. Systematically, with fire and earth, and a controlled fury that Roku rarely displayed but which the situation required. He confronted Sozin in the rubble of that ambition and told him clearly, "This will not happen. I am the Avatar. I am the representative of all 4 nations and of the balance between them, and I will stop you if you try again." He gave Sozin his life when he could have ended it. Because Sozin was his friend, and because Roku believed in the capacity of people to change, and because ending Sozin there would have been an act that the rest of his lifetime proved he was right to avoid on principle, even if the specific calculation was ultimately wrong. He spared his old friend. He made clear the terms. And then he returned to his life on the island he had built with his wife Tamin, the island he loved, the volcanic island in the warm sea where he had chosen to live out his days as a man, rather than only as an avatar. They did not speak again for years. The friendship, which had survived 12 years of absence through some form of faith in its own continuation, did not survive the confrontation. Not because they stopped caring about each other, perhaps, but because they had arrived at an incompatibility that care alone could not bridge. Sozin's ambition was not a phase. It was a conviction, and Roku's position was not a preference. It was a calling. The two things could not exist in the same conversation for long, without the conversation ending. The moment that makes this tragedy complete, the moment that you can return to indefinitely and still find new weight in, came years later, when the volcano beneath Roku's island erupted. It erupted without warning, the way volcanic eruptions do, a geological event on a geological timeline that had nothing to do with anything happening in the human world above it. Roku was there. He fought it. Because Roku was Roku, he bent the earth and the fire with everything he had, trying to prevent the lava from reaching the island's villages, trying to hold back something that could not be held back by any amount of individual skill for very long. He was losing. The gas was thick. The ash was suffocating. He was the most powerful bender of his generation, the avatar in full command of all four elements, and he was losing to a volcano because volcanoes do not care who you are. And then Sozin came. He came in from the sky, landed beside his old friend, and bent fire alongside him. They worked together in the smoke and the gas and the heat. They worked the way they must have trained together as boys, with the specific fluency of two people who know each other's movements, who can coordinate without communicating because the years they spent together are in their bodies as well as their memories. For a few minutes it seemed possible that the friendship had survived everything and was present here, in the ash, doing what friendship does at its most essential, which is to show up. And then the gas thickened beyond what Roku could breathe, and Roku fell, and Sozin looked at him. The show holds this moment. It does not rush through it or give Sozin an expression that tells you what to feel about it. He looks at his oldest friend lying in the volcanic ash, and then he looks at the ash, and then he leaves. He rises into the sky and flies away. And the camera stays on the mountain long enough for you to understand that Roku and his dragon Fang, who refused to leave him and curled around him and died alongside him, are being left there, deliberately, by the man who came to help them. Because Sozin understood, in that moment, that Roku's death solved a problem. Not the problem of their friendship, not the problem of what they had been to each other as boys, the problem of the Avatar. The Avatar was the obstacle to the expansion Sozin had wanted for decades, and the Avatar was dying in the ash right in front of him. And if the Avatar died here, the cycle would advance, and a new Avatar would be born. And a new Avatar was 12 years away from becoming a threat, and 12 years was enough time to do what needed to be done. He did not kill Roku. That is the precise horror of it. He simply chose not to save him. He took the action that was almost, but not quite, an action. And sometimes the difference between killing someone and not saving them is thinner than anyone who has not stood at that specific juncture can fully understand, and the consequences on the other side of the decision are exactly the same. 12 years after Roku died on his island, Sozin used the comet that would be renamed for him, Sozin's Comet, a comet that amplified the power of every firebender alive by an order of magnitude that ordinary military resistance could not match. And with that amplification, on a single morning, he launched simultaneous attacks on all four air temples. The air nomad genocide was the act that opened the 100-Year War, and it was preceded by this. A friendship between two boys born on the same day who were each other's closest companion for 16 years, who spent decades apart and still recognized each other when they were old men, and who ended with one of them dying in volcanic ash and the other flying away into the sky with a calculation running behind his eyes. Sozin spent the rest of his life, years and years after Roku's death, after the genocide, after the war began and the Fire Nation started conquering the Earth Kingdom province by province, searching for the next avatar. He was told by his own historians that he died peacefully in his sleep, a very old and successful man, that the war was righteous, that the prosperity was a gift. None of his subjects were permitted to learn otherwise, and the searching, the decades of sending scouts and soldiers to find a 12-year-old air nomad avatar who seemed impossible to locate, the systematic failure of that search, the way it consumed the last years of his life without resolution, is not part of the official history. The 12-year-old he was searching for was alive in the ice, frozen in the Southern Ocean, preserved in the avatar state, drifting below the surface of the world that had moved on without him. And all of Sozin's searching never came close to finding him. The comet bore his name. The war bore the shape of his ambition, and the boy who would end it was right there, at the bottom of the world, waiting to be found by two children from the tribe whose waterbenders, Sozin's successors, would spend decades systematically imprisoning. Some endings wait for the precise moment they are needed. Section 3. The Air Nomad Genocide: What Was Lost and What It Cost. There is a moment in Avatar, The Last Airbender, that is, in terms of its emotional precision and its willingness to hold the full weight of what it depicts, one of the most devastating moments in the history of animated television. Not because it is graphic, not because it shows you something terrible directly, but because of what it shows you next to the terrible thing. Aang arrives at the Southern Air Temple in the second episode of the first season. He has been frozen in ice for 100 years and has not yet fully absorbed what that means. He runs through the temple's corridors the way you run through a place you love, fast, with the specific lightness of someone whose feet know the ground without needing to look at it. He calls out for Gyatso. He is laughing. He is excited in the way that people are excited before they know what they are returning to, with the uncomplicated joy of anticipation before the reality of the return sets in. And then he finds the skeletons. Not one or two, many. The remains of the monks who raised him, the teachers and the elders and the other children who trained alongside him, scattered through the corridors and chambers of the temple with the specific arrangement of things that were interrupted mid-motion, that stopped exactly where they were when the Force reached them. The Southern Air Temple is a tomb. It has been a tomb for 100 years. And Aang, arriving with the innocence of someone who has not yet fully processed the passage of the century he missed, walks into it thinking he is home. He finds Gyatso's remains in a chamber that he knows well, knows every corner of, every marking on the walls, every air current that moves through it at different hours of the day. And Gyatso is there, among the remains of dozens of Fire Nation soldiers in armor. Not beside them, among them. Gyatso died taking down soldiers. Many soldiers. He bent air until there was no more air to bend, and then he bent whatever he had left, and the proof that he was not taken easily is distributed across the floor of the chamber in Fire Nation armor that has been there for 100 years. Aang goes into the Avatar state, not because he chooses to, because the body sometimes has responses to grief that bypass choice entirely. The glow ignites in his eyes. The power of every life the Avatar has ever lived floods through a 12-year-old boy who has just understood, with the specific completeness of understanding that has no softening at its edges, that he is the last, that every person he loved is gone, that the world he left on the back of a bison one night, afraid of what the monks were planning, does not exist anymore in any form except the stone and the ash and the bones that are all that remains of people who deserved better. The Air Nomad Genocide was systematic. Sozin used the comet to launch simultaneous attacks on all 4 air temples because the avatars reincarnate within the air nomad cycle at the appropriate moment, and Sozin knew, having consulted what intelligence was available to him, that the next avatar would be born among the air nomads. Not necessarily at any specific temple, but within the population. To eliminate the next avatar before the next avatar could act, you had to eliminate the population that would produce them. So Sozin did. The attacks came at dawn, coordinated, using the comet-amplified power of the Fire Nation's military, firebending that was exponentially stronger than anything the air nomads had encountered before, exponentially stronger than anything in the Fire Nation's normal arsenal. The air nomads were practitioners of a defensive martial art. Airbending, as the show establishes in its fundamental philosophy, is built around evasion and redirection, around the avoidance of direct conflict rather than the engagement with it. Against firebenders at normal power levels, a skilled airbender could evade and redirect indefinitely. Against firebenders amplified by Sozin's comet, the calculus changed. The air nomads fought. The show makes this clear in the evidence it leaves for you rather than the events it depicts. The skeletons of Fire Nation soldiers alongside the remains of the monks tell you that the air nomads were not passive in the face of what was coming for them. They bent with everything available to them. They used every technique their philosophy had given them, and they still fell, because the power differential was simply too vast, and because there is a limit to what even the most skilled defensive art can achieve against a force that does not need to be evaded in order to win, only to outlast. Every airbender died. Every animal connected to the air nomad way of life, the sky bison who were both the nomads' transportation and the original source of airbending, the creatures from whom the air nomads first learned to bend by watching and imitating their movements, the animals who had lived alongside the air nomad people for generations and who were as culturally central as any practice or philosophy the nomads held, were killed too. The Fire Nation soldiers who attacked the temples were thorough, Erasure is more complete when it does not stop at the people, when it extends to the animals and the art and the records and the living continuity of a tradition. Aang was not there. He had fled the night before the attacks, frightened and hurt after the monks told him they were planning to send him away to the Eastern Air Temple for more intensive avatar training, to separate him from Gyatso because Gyatso's friendship was making him too attached to the things of the world. He ran. He took Appa and flew south, into the storm that would eventually drive them down into the Southern Ocean and freeze them in ice, and he was not at the Southern Air Temple when the Fire Nation soldiers arrived in the pre-dawn light of the morning that ended the Air Nomad civilization. The sole survivor of the Air Nomad genocide was the one airbender who was not there because he ran away. This is a specific kind of guilt that has no bottom and no clean edge and no simple resolution. Not just the guilt of surviving when others did not, which is already among the heavier emotional experiences a person can carry, but the guilt of having been absent by choice, of having run from something manageable and in running stumbled accidentally into survival, while the people you ran from were dying. The guilt of not having been there to fight, or to help, or to be found among the dead with the same evidence of resistance that Gyatso left behind. The guilt of being 12 years old and frightened and in love with your teacher's company in a way the monks found theologically problematic, and of that specific, ordinary, human combination of adolescent fear and attachment being the only reason you are alive. What was lost with the air nomads is the kind of loss that cannot be totaled. The lives, yes, of every man and woman and child who lived in those temples, and who traveled between them, and who carried in their bodies the specific physical knowledge of how to move through the air, but also the accumulated wisdom of a culture that had been developing its spiritual practice, its philosophy of non-attachment, its understanding of the relationship between breath and movement, and the element that is as close as anything in the material world gets to the spiritual dimension, for thousands of years. Aang rediscovers things about airbending throughout the series by accident, by doing something that feels right before he knows what it is called, by encountering scrolls and ruined temples that describe techniques he has already intuited, by feeling his way toward practices that his body knows from a lifetime of training even when his mind has no name for them. The tradition lives in him in a way that is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because nothing the Fire Nation did could take it from the one person who survived. Heartbreaking because the living tradition of thousands of years of continuous practice exists now only in one person's muscle memory, and one boy's imperfectly remembered childhood. By the time the show begins, Aang has been carrying the weight of this loss for 100 years while also being, in some sense, asleep to it. He wakes into the full knowledge of what happened gradually, episode by episode, as the world around him makes it impossible to maintain the dream that something of the air nomads remains. The Southern Air Temple is a tomb. The Eastern Air Temple is inhabited by refugees who have transformed it with technology. The Western Air Temple is hidden and damaged. Every temple he visits is a monument not to the air nomads but to their absence, to the specific shape of what used to be there and is no longer. He does not process this cleanly. He does not have a cathartic moment in which he cries the necessary amount and then feels better and moves forward unencumbered. The grief is present in episode 60 as it was in episode 1. It surfaces in specific moments, in specific places, when specific stimuli trigger the part of him that has never fully absorbed what happened, and the show never suggests that this is something to be solved or overcome. It simply depicts, with unusual honesty for any medium, let alone a children's animated series, what it looks like to carry a grief that is genuinely too large for any individual to process in a normal human lifetime. What it looks like to be the last and to know it and to keep moving anyway. The air nomad genocide is the wound at the center of everything. Every choice Aang makes as an avatar is made in the shadow of what it costs to produce an avatar from his people. Every conversation about violence and non-violence in the show carries the specific weight of a pacifist philosophy that was not able to save the pacifists who practiced it. Every moment of levity in the show, every joke and every game and every flight on Appa's back is colored by the knowledge of what it costs to have this particular boy alive to play and joke and fly. The wound does not heal in 61 episodes. The point is not the healing. The point is what you do with the wound present, what you build in the space that the loss has opened, what you choose to be when the thing that defined you is gone and you are still here, still breathing, still required by history to do something with the fact of your survival. Section 4. The Dark Heart of the Fire Nation Royal Family. If you wanted to understand the full psychological architecture of the Fire Nation's violence, the place to start is not Fire Lord Ozai, though Ozai is where most of the visible damage lands. The place to start is the generation before him, and the specific transaction that handed the Fire Nation throne to a man who would burn his own son's face. Iroh was the crown prince, eldest son of Fire Lord Azulon, grandson of Sozin, heir to the throne that carried the weight of the 100-Year War's accumulated momentum. He was a formidable military commander. He laid siege to Ba Sing Se for 600 days. 600 days of continuous pressure on walls that had never been breached. Walls that were, by every reasonable metric, not breachable by any force that had previously attempted them. Iroh got closer than anyone before him. He was legendary in the Fire Nation for this. The Dragon of the West, the general who almost did the impossible. He had a son, Lu Ten, a young prince who went to war alongside his father because that is what Fire Nation royalty did. Because the culture of the Fire Nation in the century of war was a culture that glorified military service and martial excellence, and because Iroh himself was a man shaped by that culture, a man who called his son Little Soldier Boy from childhood without recognizing, until much later, what kind of path he was laying for a boy who was still learning to walk. Lu Ten died at Ba Sing Se. In the walls, on the outside, while his father commanded the ongoing siege. He was not much older than Zuko when Zuko was exiled. When the news reached Iroh, he abandoned the siege. Not strategically, not with an ordered withdrawal. He simply stopped, pulled his forces back and returned to the Fire Nation with his army intact, but the reason for the siege dissolved. He had been trying to conquer Ba Sing Se because that was what the war required. But the war, in the absence of his son, suddenly had no weight. It had no gravity. The ambition that had driven it in Iroh's chest simply stopped having anything to pull against, and without that pull, it dispersed. Iroh's grief after Lu Ten's death is the hinge on which everything else turns. It transformed him from one of the most dangerous military commanders in the Fire Nation into a wandering, tea-obsessed eccentric who spoke in philosophical riddles and lost pie show tiles. From the outside, this looked like breakdown. From the inside, it was something more complicated. It was the process of a man dismantling the system of values that had organized his life and finding himself in the rubble of that system without a framework for what to build instead. He traveled. He sought out wisdom from every tradition available to him. He eventually found, or was found by, the Order of the White Lotus. The Order of the White Lotus was, at its core, a society of masters from all 4 nations who had each, through their own path, arrived at the same understanding. That the divisions between nations were less fundamental than the connections, that the war had been wrong from its inception, and that the preservation of wisdom and balance was more important than the loyalty that nations demanded. They organized themselves around the game of PI show as a cover and a communication system, using specific tile arrangements to recognize one another across borders that technically made them enemies. Iroh became the Grand Lotus. He rose through the organization with the rapidity of someone who has found, late in life, the thing they were always supposed to be doing. And then, with the specific understanding of a man who has been through all of this, he accompanied his nephew Zuko into exile. Because Zuko was the only family left who needed him, and because Iroh recognized in Zuko something that his own journey had taught him to recognize, a person who had been shaped by broken things and who still had the capacity, if someone showed up for them consistently, to become something different. But before we get to Zuko, we need to understand how Ozai got the throne, because the mechanics of this transfer are dark in a way that illuminates everything that follows. When Iroh returned from Ba Sing Se without his son and without his military momentum, Ozai went to Fire Lord Azulon and made a proposal. His brother's line had ended with Lu Ten. Ozai's line was intact. His children Zuko and Azula were alive and growing. He proposed that Iroh's birthright as crown prince be transferred to him. He made this proposal while Iroh was still in active grief over his son's death. Whatever the political logic of the proposal might have been in the abstract, the timing was something else entirely. Azulon was, by all accounts, genuinely angry. Not because the proposal was politically incoherent, but because of its moral dimensions. He ordered Ozai to kill his own son Zuko so that Ozai could understand what he was asking Iroh to accept. This was not Azulon being protective of Zuko. This was Azulon deploying punishment in the form of symmetry. demanding that Ozai experience the loss he was willing to capitalize on in his brother's case. Ursa found out, and she did what she did because it was the only thing available to her that would save her son's life. She went to Ozai with a poison she had made herself, slow-acting and undetectable, and she offered to use it on Azulon. She killed the Fire Lord to save her son. In exchange, Ozai took the throne, and Ursa was exiled. She was forbidden to write to her children or contact them in any way. She was forbidden to take them with her, threatened that if she tried, they would be hunted and killed. She walked out of the palace and did not come back, and Zuko and Azula grew up in the knowledge that their mother was gone without ever fully understanding why she had to go. What Ozai did with this arrangement tells you exactly who he was. He took the throne that her act had given him. He used the power she gave him to exile her and control his children. And then, according to what the comics eventually reveal, he directed specific cruelty at Zuko not because of anything Zuko had done, but because Zuko was Ursa's son, the child whose life had cost Ozai his father, the living evidence of a bargain that had made Ozai powerful, and had required him to let the woman who made him powerful walk away. Zuko paid for his own survival, not consciously, not in any moment where Ozai articulated this, but it was there, in the accumulated dismissals, and the contempt, and the specific quality of Ozai's attention toward his son, which was always either absence or damage, nothing in between. And then the War Council. Zuko was 13. He was brought to a meeting where a general proposed sending a regiment of inexperienced new recruits, boys barely older than Zuko himself, as a diversionary force in a battle where they would serve no tactical purpose except to distract enemy forces, while real soldiers accomplish the actual objective. The diversionary force would almost certainly be destroyed. And the general was proposing this with the smooth certainty of someone who had made this calculation many times before, who had the ability to make this calculation because the people he was calculating about were abstractions, numbers on a map rather than boys with families. Zuko spoke. He challenged the plan. Not in anger, not in political calculation, but because he was 13 years old and the boys being sent to die were not abstractions to him the way they were to the general. He said that the plan was wrong, that these soldiers deserved better, that to use inexperienced recruits as sacrificial diversions was dishonorable and ought not to be done. He said it in Ozai's War Council, in a room where speaking without being called upon was already a violation of protocol. To a general whose plan had Ozai's implicit support, the Agni Kai was declared. Zuko believed he was fighting the general. He walked into the arena in his armor and turned to face whoever was there, and the figure across the arena removed their hood. And it was Ozai. Zuko refused to fight. He knelt. He begged for forgiveness. He used the language of a son speaking to a father. Please forgive me. Please. Because in that moment, the political machinery and the military honor and all of it collapsed into what it actually was. A child in front of a parent, asking not to be hurt. Ozai burned his face. He held his son's head to the ground with his firebending, and he burned the left side of his son's face with a deliberateness that was not a punishment in the heat of anger. It was a statement, made in front of the War Council, made in the arena where honor was supposedly the whole point. A statement about what speaking out of turn costs, delivered in a language that would be visible on Zuko's face for the rest of his life. And then he exiled him. He gave his 13-year-old son, who now had a burned face and no army and no support, a quest to capture the Avatar who had been missing for 100 years, with the promise that capturing the Avatar would restore his honor and allow him to come home. The quest was designed to be impossible, not because Ozai had studied the odds, but because impossible quests are the most elegant form of exile. They give the exiled person something to pursue. They let the exiling party say, truthfully, that the door is not closed, that the return is possible, in theory, while ensuring that the conditions for return will never be met. Zuko spent 3 years chasing that promise across a world that was falling apart around him, always one step behind the thing he needed, always arriving where the Avatar had been instead of where the Avatar was. He brought Iroh with him, and Iroh watched him, and waited, and offered what wisdom he could into the specific silence of a nephew who was not yet ready to hear most of it. And the scar on Zuko's face was always there, in every frame of every episode, visible to the camera and to everyone in the show and to everyone watching, doing what it was designed to do. Making the price of speaking visible? Section 5. Azula, a mind collapsing under its own perfection. Near the end of Avatar, The Last Airbender's third season, there is a scene that is unlike anything else in the show and unlike very much in animated television as a whole. Azula stands alone in her coronation chamber, in front of a mirror, and she sees her mother. Ursa's face appears in the reflection, and Ursa says something gentle, something that a mother might say to a daughter on the morning of her greatest achievement. And Azula responds, "No, you are not." Not with anger. Not with the performance of anger that she uses everywhere else. With the flat, tired certainty of someone who has known a thing for a very long time and is no longer willing to pretend otherwise. She has always known that her mother did not love her the way she loved Zuko. She has known this since she was small enough that the knowing did not yet have a name. And she has built, over the years between then and now, an entire architecture of self-protection around that knowledge, an architecture of control and excellence, and the specific certainty that she does not need what she does not have. The architecture is collapsing. That is what this scene is showing you. The mirror breaks, Azula smashes it, and the sound of it, the silence after it, the way the pieces fall, is the sound of a structure that has been under too much pressure for too long, finally reaching the failure point. Azula was 14 years old during Book 3. The show is specific about this. She is 2 years younger than Zuko. She is a child by any definition that matters, and she is also the most frighteningly capable antagonist the show presents across 3 seasons. A prodigy of firebending whose flames burn blue, which the show establishes burns at a higher temperature than ordinary orange fire, a visual shorthand for the precision and intensity of her power. She was performing full lightning generation by her early adolescence. She was conducting strategic military operations that would have challenged experienced adult commanders. She was, by any external metric, extraordinary. The extraordinary was built on a foundation that was always going to crack under the weight of it. Ozai shaped Azula from early childhood as a weapon, not in the way he shaped Zuko, through dismissal and punishment, but through elevation and approval contingent on performance. He told her she was exceptional. He told her that weakness was for other people. He modeled for her a relationship between power and love, in which love was what you received when you performed well, which means that love was never unconditional, which means that it was never really love, which means that she has spent her entire life working towards something that cannot be reached from the angle she is approaching it from. The emotional logic of Azula's psychology is spelled out in the show's background details rather than its dialogue. In the flashbacks and the brief glimpses of the royal family before everything fell apart. In Zuko alone, the Book 2 episode that traces Zuko's childhood through a series of memory vignettes, we see young Azula and young Zuko playing together in the palace. And Azula is already doing what she will spend her whole life doing. She is being cruel to her brother in small, deliberate ways, and she is watching for the reaction. And the reaction she is watching for is not fear or pain but something else. Something harder to name. Something that looks like she is testing the waters of a love she suspects is not hers, and wants to understand the dimensions of that absence. She told Zuko their mother was going to Ozai, to have Ozai kill Zuko. Whether she knew this was accurate at the time or whether it was speculation presented as certainty, the show is not fully clear, but she told him. She walked to his room and she told him the darkest thing she knew. And then she watched what it did to him. And then she went to bed. This is not the behavior of a child who is straightforwardly cruel. This is the behavior of a child who does not know what to do with feelings too complicated and too painful for her to express in any other form, and who has already learned that the way to have power over a situation that frightens you is to be the one who delivers the information rather than the one who receives it. She has Ozai's approval, and she has it in the most complete way possible, because she has made herself into the thing Ozai values most. She is his heir apparent. She is the one he trusts to accomplish what Zuko could not. She is his instrument, his weapon, his proof that the Fire Nation royal line produces excellence. She has built this role so completely around herself that she and the role are, to any external observer, indistinguishable. She performs the role perfectly because there is nothing in her that exists outside the performance. And then Mai and Ty Lee betrayed her. At the Boiling Rock, the Fire Nation's most secure prison, Ty Lee Chi blocked the Dai Li agents who were restraining Mai, because Mai had chosen Zuko over Azula by refusing to stand aside when Zuko was captured. The calculation Ty Lee made was simple and devastating. She chose her friend over the person she feared, and the fact that she had to make this choice at all told Azula everything she did not want to know about the nature of loyalty that is built on fear. Fear makes people compliant. It does not make them stay. The paranoia that followed was not a departure from who Azula was. It was the logical conclusion of a psychology that had always operated on control as its primary instrument. If you believe, at the deepest level, that every person around you is a potential threat who complies with your will because they are afraid, then every person who is no longer afraid is an immediate threat. And if the friends who were supposed to fear you were, it turns out, friends with conditions attached to their loyalty, then what can be said about the Dai Li, who are professionals? What can be said about anyone? She dismissed her servants. She banished her guards. She accused a servant of trying to kill her when the servant brought fruit with the pit still inside it, and she was not performing paranoia for effect. The paranoia was real. The threat assessment was genuine, operating on a faulty input model that had become decoupled from observable reality. She was experiencing, in the clinical sense, a breakdown of her ability to interpret the social world around her. The hallucination of Ursa was the surface expression of the wound underneath everything. Azula has never processed her mother's abandonment. She has addressed it only through the architecture of denial, the insistence that she did not need what was taken, that the thing taken was not worth wanting, that her own perfection was sufficient substitute for the thing missing. But sufficiency and replacement are not the same thing. You can be sufficient for everything except the specific thing that is absent. And the specific thing that was absent for Azula, the unconditional love of a mother who found the thing her daughter was doing not adorable but alarming, was the one thing her performance and her excellence and her blue fire and her strategic genius could not substitute for. And so she appears in the mirror. On the morning of the achievement that was supposed to prove that Azula had won, that she had arrived, that she was enough, and Azula tells the reflection, "No, you are not proud of me." And she is right. And being right about this has cost her everything. The final fight between Zuko and Azula is filmed like a tragedy rather than an action sequence because it is a tragedy rather than an action sequence. Two siblings, products of the same broken family, destroying each other in an arena that was built for exactly this. The blue fire that has always expressed her precision becomes erratic, unpredictable, a living demonstration of the state of the mind directing it. Order versus chaos, stability versus disintegration, in the color of the fire itself. And when she falls, trapped by Katara's ice rather than defeated by Zuko's firebending, she falls in a way that is nothing like the composed command she has always projected. She is screaming. Not in rage. In something underneath rage, the sound of a structure coming apart at every connection simultaneously. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility after the war. The comics gesture at this. She was 14 years old. She had been built, from childhood, into a weapon, and she had never been given anything else to be. And when the purpose the weapon was built for was removed, there was nothing left that knew how to simply exist. Section 6. Bloodbending and the Horror of Hama. There is an episode of Avatar, The Last Airbender, that functions, from its opening campfire scene to its final weeping shot, as a horror film. Not as dark adventure, not as mature drama with horror elements, but as horror in the genre sense, with the grammar and the pacing and the specific emotional register that horror uses to produce something in the body that drama does not. The production team made every decision in this episode deliberately. The color palette, the music, the way the camera moves through the village at night, and the forest before dawn, all of it calibrated to produce, in a viewer who is theoretically watching a children's cartoon, the low-frequency dread that is the genre's particular signature. The Puppet Master opens with ghost stories around a campfire. This framing device is one of the oldest horror conventions in any tradition, and it is not accidental here. The ghost story around a fire in the dark is a ritual of controlled fear, a way of populating the darkness with narratives that give you permission to feel frightened by something that is, because it is a story, safe. The Puppet Master uses this convention to set your expectation and then collapse it. The ghost stories give way to something that is not a story, something that is real in the world the show is depicting. And the fear that follows is not the controlled fear of a campfire tale. It is something that does not have a frame around it. Hama is introduced as a warm old woman who runs a small inn in a remote Fire Nation village. She recognizes Katara immediately, sees through the clothes and the manner to the Southern Water Tribe girl underneath, and greets her with the warmth of someone who has been separated from her own people for a very long time and is suddenly, Unexpectedly, looking at something familiar, she becomes Katara's teacher. She shares with her the advanced waterbending techniques that the show has been building toward since Book 1, the ways of finding water in places where water is not obviously present, in the moisture of the air and the sap of plants and the dew on surfaces that appear dry. All of this warmth and teaching and generosity of knowledge is real. Hama is not performing. She genuinely recognizes something of herself in Katara, genuinely wants to give her what she knows, genuinely carries the specific tenderness toward her own culture's continuation that people who survive cultural destruction carry toward every evidence that something of the culture survived alongside them. This is what makes what she actually is so disturbing when it emerges. She was not always this. She was made into this. And what she was made into was made by real and genuine suffering. Hama was the last waterbender taken from the Southern Water Tribe by Fire Nation raids. The raids on the Southern Water Tribe's waterbenders were systematic, not incidental violence of war, but targeted extraction, designed specifically to remove the people who could bend water from a tribe that depended on waterbending for its defense and its spiritual life. One by one, across years, Fire Nation soldiers came to the tribe and took them. Not killed them necessarily, took them, imprisoned them. The waterbenders of the Southern Water Tribe were taken away across Katara's mother's childhood and her childhood both, one by one, until Katara was the only one left and Kia died to protect her from being taken in turn. Hama was the last before Katara, and she was taken to a Fire Nation prison that had been specifically engineered to hold waterbenders. The engineering was thoughtful in the way that cruelty is sometimes thoughtful, when the person designing it has spent real time considering the problem. Waterbenders draw power from water. Remove the water, and you remove the power. So the cells were kept dry, with forced air systems that removed ambient moisture. The prisoners' arms and legs were restrained before any water was given to them for drinking. Every possible source of liquid was eliminated from their environment. The prison was a container built around a single question. How do you hold someone whose power is in the element that is everywhere? Hama sat in that cell for years. And she thought about water the way someone thinks about something they love when it has been taken away, not romantically, but practically, with the specific attention of a person for whom the thing they are thinking about is both the object of longing and the means of survival. She thought about where water was when you could not see it. In the air, even the dry air they pumped into her cell. In the walls, in the stone, in the roots that worked their way through from the outside toward the water table below. She discovered that she could bend the trace moisture in the roots. She developed this ability slowly, over time, as a prisoner with nothing to do but think and practice in the only dimension her jailers had not fully closed off. She worked toward the roots, and then toward the walls, and then toward the guard. The human body is 60 to 70% water. This fact, which belongs to biology class, belongs here too in the logic of what Hama discovered in her cell. She could feel the water in the guard's body through the same sense she had developed to feel the trace moisture in the walls, and she found that she could bend it, move it, and where the water in a body moves, the body follows, because the body is the water's container, and the container moves with what fills it. She walked out of the prison with the guard's body moving as she directed, and she did not stop to consider what she had invented, because she was not inventing it for philosophy. She was inventing it to get out. The technique, which she would later name bloodbending, was born not in a moment of dark ambition, but in a prison cell designed to destroy her, as the only available response to a system that had taken everything else. What she did with the technique after her escape is where the moral weight of her story shifts. She made her way to a small Fire Nation village, the village where Team Avatar finds her, and she established herself there with the patience of someone who is very good at being something they are not. And every full moon, using the amplified power of the full moon on her waterbending, she kidnapped Fire Nation villagers from the town. Not soldiers, civilians, ordinary people who happened to live in the country whose military had imprisoned her. She took them to a cave in the mountains and kept them there. She was doing to innocent Fire Nation civilians what the Fire Nation's military had done to innocent Southern Water Tribe waterbenders. Not in the same conditions, not with the same deliberate engineering of maximum suffering, but in the same fundamental structure, people taken from their lives and held in a place they did not choose by someone who decided that their nationality made them acceptable targets for the punishment of others with that nationality. The show does not tell you this is justice. It does not ask you to be comfortable with it. It shows you a woman who suffered and who created, out of that suffering, something that perpetuates suffering in a different direction, and it trusts you to hold both the suffering and the perpetuation simultaneously without resolving one into the other. Hama was wronged, and Hama wronged others, and neither of these facts cancels the other. Katara is forced to bloodbend Hama to save Aang and Sokka, who Hama has taken control of and is directing toward each other in the way that a person without any other means of winning a fight can sometimes win it by making the people you love fight each other. Katara uses the technique she found so revolting that she refused to learn it, refused even to hear about it without horror, and she uses it because it is the only thing that will work in this moment. And Hama laughs. The laugh is not triumph over Katara in the fight. It is triumph over something larger than the fight. She has passed something on. The technique will not die with her. The darkness she made in her cell has found a new vessel. Katara is crying at the end. Not from victory, from the recognition, which she will carry for the rest of the series, that the things we find most repellent have a way of finding us when the circumstances are precisely wrong. That the lines we draw around ourselves are real until the moment they are the only thing standing between the people we love and the harm coming toward them, and that crossing them does not make us different people. It makes us people who have crossed them, who carry the crossing, who know that we are capable of the thing we did not think we were capable of. Section 7. Ba Sing Se's Secret Darkness, the city that swallowed the war. Ba Sing Se is the largest city in the Avatar world. Its walls are the first thing you understand about it. Walls so massive and so ancient that they have become, over 100 years of the Fire Nation's attempts to breach them, something more than a military fortification. They are a psychological fact. They are proof, in stone, that something can be held against everything trying to destroy it. Inside the walls, the city functions as a kind of argument. See, here is Ba Sing Se, still standing, still present, evidence that the Earth Kingdom endures. The argument is true. The city is standing. But the thing that stands inside the walls is not quite what the walls advertise it to be, and the difference between what Ba Sing Se presents and what Ba Sing Se is has been maintained for years by one of the most sophisticated systems of information control in the show's world. Longfeng is the Grand Secretariat of Ba Sing Se, which is the title that says civilian administrator but means something closer to the person who actually runs the city, because the person who is supposed to run the city, the Earth King Kui, has been kept in a state of managed ignorance, so complete that he is effectively a figurehead with no idea that he is a figurehead. Earth King Kui is not unintelligent. He is kind, even. He has a bear, just a regular bear, not a hybrid animal but an actual ordinary bear named Bosco, and his relationship with Bosco contains more genuine warmth than most of the relationships in the upper ring of Ba Sing Se. He is simply a man who has never been allowed to know what he is presiding over, because the people around him determined early in his reign that his ignorance was more useful than his awareness. Longfeng created this situation and maintains it with the specific efficiency of someone who has had a long time to perfect the machinery. The Dai Li are his instruments, elite earthbenders who were founded by Avatar Kyoshi herself to protect Ba Sing Se's cultural heritage and who have been redirected, over the years, into a secret police force that monitors anyone of significance who enters the city. They watch, they follow, they listen, and when someone says something that approaches the truth that is not permitted to be said in Ba Sing Se, which is that there is a war happening, they remove that person. The removal happens at Lake Laogai, a lake on the outskirts of the city that most citizens of Ba Sing Se have no reason to think about in any particular way. Under the lake, in caverns that were excavated and fitted with cells and conditioning chambers, the Dai Li conduct the process they call re-education, and which is, functionally, the destruction of a person's memory of specific things and the replacement of those memories with approved alternatives. Jet is brainwashed by the Dai Li, and the results of it are specific and thorough. He cannot remember what was done to him. He cannot be fully reached by Katara's healing even when she tries. The things that were installed in him in those caverns occupy the space where the real events were, and the installation is deep enough that argument and love and even water-bending healing cannot fully displace it. He remembers, briefly, near the end. The memories resurface through the same trauma response that the brainwashing used to install them, a reversal of the process that leaves him in a state that is more painful than ignorance and not fully coherent. He dies knowing what was done to him. This is the show's version of mercy. It gives him the truth before the end, even though the truth is terrible. The Judies are perhaps the most quietly horrifying feature of the whole apparatus. They are not a person. Judy is a program. Multiple women, selected and brainwashed into becoming identical guides, cheerful and impossibly helpful, and absolutely impervious to any question that approaches what cannot be said. They are assigned to important visitors as cultural ambassadors, which is the official title for the person whose job it is to make sure important visitors never talk to the Earth King, never learn what is happening in the world, and never have any means of acting on any information that might disrupt the equilibrium. Longfeng has spent years constructing. When Judy is eventually replaced, the new Judy is indistinguishable from the old one. Same smile, same professional deflection, same refusal to engage with reality. The women behind the persona have different faces and different histories, but the Judy is always the same because the Judy is the program, not the person running it. And somewhere underneath each Judy, there is a woman who used to be someone else, who knew things and thought things and was, before the Dai Li found her, a person rather than a function. The refugees in Ba Sing Se's lower ring call themselves newcomers. This is the permitted word. Refugee implies a place you left under duress. Newcomer implies a place you chose. The people in the lower ring know the difference. They know what they are. But they have been told, through the specific language of a system that understands the power of naming, that what they are is not the word they would use, and they use the permitted word because the consequences of the other word are clear even when they are never articulated. The Dai Li are everywhere. The underground is available to anyone who forgets themselves. This is what the city's peace costs. It costs the truth. Every day, every person in Ba Sing Se with any memory of what the world outside the walls is actually like is required to carry that memory in silence, to perform a version of themselves that does not know what they know, to cooperate with an epistemological project whose goal is the maintenance of a fiction at the expense of everything that makes fiction distinguishable from reality. When Azula arrives in Ba Sing Se with Zuko, she does something that Longfeng could not do, because Longfeng was a man with a theory and a machine, and Azula is a person with an instinct for power that operates faster than theory. She looks at the Dai Li, and she sees immediately that their loyalty is to the system rather than to its current operator, and she offers them a better operator. She is more dangerous than Longfeng. She is younger and more capable, and she will win the war that Longfeng has been preventing from entering the city's consciousness. The Dai Li transfers their loyalty in the time it takes Azula to make the argument. The city falls from the inside. Not because the walls were breached, because what the walls contained was already hollow, already built on a lie, and the lie was waiting for someone willing to tell a better one. Section 8. Ko, Wan Shi Tong, and what the spirit world actually is. The spirit world in Avatar. The Last Airbender is not a comforting place, and this is easy to forget because the show occasionally depicts it with a kind of dreamlike painterly beauty, colors more saturated or more drained than the physical world. The visual grammar shifted just enough from the familiar that you know you are somewhere that operates by different physics. But different physics does not mean safer physics. The spirit world operates on a set of principles that have nothing to do with human comfort, human time, or the human assumption that intelligence and power exist in some proportional relationship to benevolence. Ko the Face Stealer is the most explicit articulation of what the spirit world actually contains. He is one of the oldest spirits in the Avatar world, so old that he remembers things that happened before the current structure of the world's spiritual architecture was established. His body is enormous and centipedal, many legs, many segments, moving through his domain with the ease of something that has never needed to accommodate the preferences of anything else. His face changes constantly, cycling through the faces he has taken across centuries of encounters with beings who made the mistake of expressing emotion in his presence. He was born from the Mother of Faces, an ancient spirit who creates the faces of all living beings. His mother is, by contrast to her son, capable of genuine kindness. She appears once a season and grants a favor to a human who finds her. She restored the face that Ko had stolen from a man who had encountered him in the comics that follow the original series. She is vast and ancient and essentially benign in her dealings with humans. And her son is estranged from her completely, has been since time began, because the two of them have fundamentally incompatible relationships to the faces that are the medium of both of their existences. She creates them, he collects them. The legends about Ko say that he misses his mother so much that he has spent all of history stealing the things she makes, as if possession of her creations is the closest thing available to closeness with her. He chose the name Ko for himself after the estrangement. His mother did not know he had chosen a name. The distance between them is so complete that even the name he gave himself, the basic act of self-definition, did not reach her. Ko has a particular relationship with the Avatar. He stole the face of Umi, who was engaged to marry Avatar Kuruk, as a direct consequence of Kuruk's arrogance and neglect of his Avatar duties. Kuruk served after Avatar Yang Chen, who had been so extraordinarily effective in her tenure that the world she left behind was genuinely at peace, so thoroughly at peace that Kuruk found himself with nothing that needed doing. He was a skilled and charismatic man who, without meaningful work, became something less than what he was capable of being. He prioritized personal pleasure and entertainment and a kind of bravado that was the performance of Avatar competence rather than the exercise of it. The price was paid not by Kuruk but by Umi. Ko saw the Avatar neglecting his spiritual responsibilities, saw the arrogance of a man who treated his extraordinary mandate as a light thing, and he punished the Avatar in the way that the most sophisticated cruelty always works, which is not to harm the person directly but to harm the thing they love most. He took Umi's face on the day of their wedding, or just before it, and Kuruk spent the rest of his life and then some portion of his afterlife hunting the spirit who had taken her. He could never bring himself to destroy Ko, not because he lacked the capacity or the will, but because destroying Ko would also destroy any possibility of recovering what was taken. The love that would have killed the spirit was the same love that kept the spirit alive. When Aang must visit Ko's domain to find information about the moon and ocean spirits during the siege of the North Pole, Avatar Roku prepares him with a single piece of advice. Show no emotion, nothing. Not surprise, not fear, not recognition, not the involuntary micro-expressions of a face that is processing what it is seeing. Because Ko reads faces, he looks for the expression that is the opening, and if he finds it, even for a fraction of a second, the face he reads becomes his. Aang sits across from a centipedal ancient spirit that cycles through a million faces and speaks in the measured, unhurried tones of something that has had more time than it knows what to do with, and he keeps his expression empty with the specific effort of someone who is terrified and cannot be terrified. The scene is one of the best in the series for exactly this quality, the suffocating requirement of performing stillness while everything in you is not still at all. Ko tests him, shows him faces designed to provoke reaction, says things designed to produce expression, and Aang holds. Because Avatar Roku told him to hold? Because Katara's face is somewhere in Ko's collection and he cannot be the person who adds more. Wan Shi Tong is a different register of ancient and a different register of dangerous. He who knows 10,000 things is the spirit of knowledge, a gigantic white and black barn owl who maintained a library of every piece of recorded information in the world and who, at some point in the centuries before the show's present, brought that library into the physical world from the spirit world and placed it in the Siwang Desert, buried beneath the surface, accessible to humans who knew where to look. He did this because he believed, or once believed, that knowledge was meant to be shared, that the accumulation of information for its own sake, without the possibility of any living mind engaging with it, was a kind of waste. He put the library in the human world, and he established one rule, a rule that seemed to him both simple and non-negotiable. Do not use this knowledge to harm another. Learn for the sake of learning. Come to understand things because understanding is its own reward. Use this gift the way it was intended to be used. The rule was broken before Team Avatar ever found the library. Fire Nation spies had entered the library in an earlier era of the war, found in it information useful to the Fire Nation's military operations, and burned the section they had found it in after extracting what they needed. Wan Shi Tong was a library keeper who watched his collection burned by the people he had invited to read it. He did not destroy them on the spot, but he remembered. And his willingness to admit humans to the library after that was accompanied by a new wariness, a close attention to the purpose behind the curiosity. When Sokka discovers the timing of the Day of Black Sun solar eclipse, the date on which firebenders would lose their power and the Fire Nation would be vulnerable to invasion, He announces their discovery with the straightforward excitement of a strategist who has just found the thing that was needed. He says out loud in the library that they have found what they needed to defeat the Fire Nation, and Wan Shitong hears him. And Wan Shitong becomes something other than the patient, slightly ominous library spirit who has been giving them a tour. He becomes something larger, more threatening, genuinely angry in the way that something ancient is angry, without the quick rise and fall of human emotion, with the settled certainty of a judgment being carried out. He buries the library. He pulls it back into the spirit world while the characters scramble toward the exit, and Toph holds the walls of the building up with earthbending from outside, fighting the pull of a spirit who simply wants his knowledge back, wants to close the thing he opened because humans have proven, again and with no apparent capacity for learning from the previous demonstration, that they cannot hold knowledge without immediately trying to weaponize it. Professor Zai stays behind. He says he can spend an eternity there. He means it. And in the decade or so that passes before the legend of Korra, when Jinora visits the library in the spirit world and finds it suspended upside down in the trees, she also finds the evidence of what an eternity looks like from the inside. Wan Shitong shows her the professor's skeletal remains against a bookshelf without ceremony, without apology. He said he could spend an eternity there. He did. The spirit world is not cruel about this. It is simply literal. The spirits are always more literal than humans expect them to be. What makes the spirit world the particular kind of dark that the show depicts is not the individual malevolence of the spirits who inhabit it. Ko is malevolent in a specific and targeted way. But most of the spirits are not malevolent. They are simply ancient, and ancient things operate by principles that have no category for human fragility, human mortality, the human tendency to treat intentions as context. The spirit world does not weigh your intentions. It responds to your actions according to its own ancient economy, and the exchange rates are not what you expect. Section 9. The characters who carry wounds that don't resolve. One of the things Avatar, The Last Airbender does, with a discipline that most storytelling does not attempt, is maintain the reality of damage across episodes and across seasons. Characters in adventure stories are, as a rule, resilient. They are hurt and then they recover, or they grow through the hurt, and the growth is the story. Avatar's characters do not always recover. They integrate. They absorb the damage and carry it forward and continue to function, sometimes beautifully, with the damage present and real, and not pretended away. Katara's grief is the most consistently maintained emotional reality in the show. She was 8 years old when her mother was killed. The Fire Nation soldier who came for the Southern Water Tribe's waterbenders was named Yon Ra. He asked who the last waterbender was, and Kia, Katara's mother, told him she was the last one. She said it to protect Katara, who was 8 years old and standing right there, who was the actual last waterbender, who would have been taken if Kaya had not stepped forward and claimed the identity herself. Yon Ra killed Kia, and 8-year-old Katara was there. She spent the years between 8 and 14 carrying this in the specific way that children carry things that are too large for them, not down, not through, but around. She built herself around the grief rather than through it. She became very good at caring for other people, at healing, at the specific tenderness of someone who knows what it is to lose something irreplaceable and extends to others the care she cannot extend to the part of herself that is still 8 years old standing next to her dead mother. She became extraordinary at waterbending in the way people become extraordinary at things when the thing is both a skill and a form of survival. When she finally has the chance to confront Yon Ra, the episode that depicts this is one of the most morally serious episodes in the series. She finds an old man who is small and frightened, who no longer commands anything, who does not even remember the woman he killed. Because to him, the woman he killed was not a person, but an action among many actions in a life organized around orders and objectives. She holds ice above him that could fall and end him. She does not let it fall. Not because she has forgiven him. The show is specific. She has not forgiven him. Not in this episode, maybe not ever. But she has understood something about the relationship between what she wants from justice and what justice can actually deliver, and she understands that killing Yon Ra will not give her what she wants, because what she wants is her mother back, and that particular want has no satisfiable form. She walks away. She carries the non-resolution. Jet's arc is the one that the show does not soften at the end. He was a child when Fire Nation soldiers burned his village and killed his parents. He survived. He built a community in the forest from other displaced children. and he called them the freedom fighters, and he led them with the specific intensity of someone who has converted enormous grief into enormous purpose. The purpose is real. He is genuinely committed to stopping the Fire Nation from doing to other families what the Fire Nation did to his family. But the conversion is not clean. The grief does not become purpose without residue. What is left in him after the conversion is a person who cannot reliably distinguish between soldiers and civilians, who sees Fire Nation identity as a sufficient category for punishment, regardless of individual history. He tried to flood a village to drown Fire Nation soldiers who were sheltering there, with the civilians still in it. He would have killed everyone in that village. Katara stops him, and the consequences of this follow him. He goes to Ba Sing Se to try to start over, to try to be someone different in a place where no one knows what he was. He is brainwashed by the Dai Li. He is briefly rescued from the brainwashing by Katara's healing and his own will to remember what was done to him. And then he dies, in a cave, with the memory returning in fragments that cost him everything to reclaim. The show handles his death with the specific ambiguity it later acknowledges. Did Jet just die? It was really unclear. This line, delivered through the Ember Island players, is not disrespect. It is the show honoring what it did by doing it again, more gently, from a different angle. Suki was captured by Azula at the end of Book 2 and held in the Boiling Rock for roughly 20 episodes of the show's runtime. The Boiling Rock is a prison set in the caldera of a volcanic island. It is surrounded on all sides by boiling water. The architecture of the place is designed not just to prevent escape, but to communicate, through its geography, a specific message about the people inside it. You are in the place that burns. You are worthless enough to be put here. You will not leave. The psychological dimensions of this message, delivered through the physical facts of the location every hour of every day of the imprisonment, are not incidental to how the prison works. She is there for 20 episodes. The show does not show us those 20 episodes for reasons that include the Nickelodeon content restrictions and also include something more deliberate, which is that the absence of those episodes is itself a form of storytelling. When we see Suki again in Book 3, she is different, not broken, not permanently damaged in a way that prevents her from functioning, but harder, more careful. The specific watchfulness of someone who has spent time in an enclosed environment where vigilance was the only tool available. There is a version of Suki that went into the Boiling Rock, and the version of Suki that came out of it is not exactly the same person. And the show lets the difference be visible without explaining it, trusting you to understand what 20 episodes of volcanic caldera imprisonment does to a person. And Aang, through all 3 seasons, demonstrates with unusual consistency and fidelity the behavioral signatures of post-traumatic stress. Not diagnosed, not named, not treated in any clinical sense, simply present. The nightmares he has in Book 2 that wake him screaming. The way certain stimuli, the sight of a temple that should be inhabited and is not, the discovery of the remains of his people, the encounter with things that belong to the air nomad world and exist now only as archaeological evidence, produce responses that are disproportionate to the immediate stimulus, because they are not responses to the immediate stimulus. They are responses to something much older and larger that has been waiting for a trigger. He avoids talking about the genocide directly. He approaches it in oblique ways, in the comments he makes when something reminds him of it, in the way he responds to the air temples differently from how he responds to every other location. He performs cheerfulness with a facility that is characteristic of people who have learned that their grief makes others uncomfortable and who have gotten very good at managing that discomfort for them. He laughs easily, and he is gentle, and he is the most consistently kind character in the show. And underneath all of this, there is a 12-year-old boy who is the last of his people and who has never, not once in 61 episodes, finished grieving what was taken from him. The show does not resolve this. It does not give Aang a cathartic moment that clears it. What it does, instead, is give him people who know. Katara knows about her mother. Sokka knows about his father being gone. Toph knows about the isolation of being hidden away. Zuko knows about the specific weight of being made to carry something that was never yours. They do not process each other's grief. They simply exist alongside it, which is what people do when they love each other and when the grief is genuinely too large for any single conversation to contain. Section 10. The Closing of the World, Sozin's Comet, Ozai's Endgame, and What Peace Costs. The series finale of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is structured as a 4-part feature-length event, approximately 92 minutes of story produced specifically to close 3 seasons of accumulated narrative weight without betraying any of it. It is one of the most ambitious finales American animation had ever attempted, and it earns that ambition by refusing to resolve the show's darkness cheaply, by making every character's ending proportional to everything they have been through, and by treating the piece that arrives at the end as a thing that was hard-won and incomplete and genuinely costly in ways that a clean ending would have made false. Ozai's plan, the plan that the 4-part finale is built around stopping, is worth understanding in its full dimensions rather than its dramatic outline. He is not planning to win a battle. He is not planning to conquer Ba Sing Se or defeat Aang in a conventional military engagement. He is planning, using the amplified power of Sozin's comet and the airship fleet he has assembled, to burn the entire Earth Kingdom continent. Not to take it, to render it uninhabitable, to reduce the largest landmass in the world to ash comprehensive enough that no civilization currently living on it can survive, so that the Fire Nation can then resettle it, starting over in a world that has been emptied of everything that was not Fire Nation. This is not military conquest. This is the elimination of the human population of an entire continent. This is what Ozai calls renaming himself the Phoenix King as he departs for the assault, which is not humility in any form. It is his statement of what he intends to be after. Not a conqueror who rules the conquered, but the originating force of a new world that does not contain the people who previously lived in it. The scale of this plan is such that even the 100-Year War, with all its documented atrocities, is prologue. The war was about control. This is about replacement. Aang has been wrestling, throughout Book 3, with the question of whether he can kill Ozai to stop this. The question is not academic. His past lives tell him it is necessary. Avatar Yang Chen, the most successful peacetime avatar in recorded history, tells him that the avatar must sometimes set aside personal beliefs for the sake of the world. Avatar Karuk tells him that he failed by refusing to make hard choices. Avatar Kyoshi, who is perhaps the most pragmatic of Aang's predecessors, tells him directly that she would have done what was necessary without hesitation. Every version of this conversation with his past selves arrives at the same place. You will need to kill him. Aang cannot accept this, and the show does not require him to accept it. This is the choice that separates Avatar from most stories about saving the world. The refusal to demand that the hero become the thing he is most opposed to in order to complete the arc. Aang's pacifism is not depicted as naive or as a character flaw to be overcome. It is depicted as the core principle of who he is, as the element in him that is most fundamentally air nomad, most fundamentally connected to the people and the tradition that produced him. To ask him to kill is to ask him to become something other than what he is. And the show finds him a different way. The lion turtle, an animal so ancient that it predates the current structure of bending, predates the 4 nations as they exist in Aang's present, belongs to an era of the world's history that the show has only gestured toward. It teaches Aang energy bending, the manipulation of the life force itself rather than any of the 4 elements. Energy bending is described as the original form, the bending that existed before the elements were separated into 4 disciplines, from a time when the distinction between what was inside a person and what was outside them was different, more permeable, less definitively drawn. With this technique, Aang takes Ozai's bending. He reaches into the energetic structure of a man who has built his entire identity around the fire he controls, the power it represents, the person it makes him in the eyes of everyone around him, and he removes it permanently. Ozai lives. But Ozai cannot bend. He cannot be the Phoenix King or the Fire Lord or the Dragon of the West or any of the other identities that firebending anchors. He is left as what he has always been beneath the performance, a man who was afraid of being ordinary and who caused incomprehensible suffering in the attempt to be extraordinary. The moment nearly kills Aang. During the fight, Ozai shatters the Avatar state connection by striking Aang at a specific point during the energy bending process, and for a long moment the Avatar cycle appears to be broken, not interrupted. Broken. The specific horror of this possibility, that the series of reincarnated avatars can end, that the cycle of peacekeeping can be interrupted permanently by a single act of violence at the right moment, is articulated in the silence of Aang's unconscious body and the expression on the faces of everyone who loves him. Katara revives him with the spirit water she has carried since Book 1, and the Avatar state returns. And Aang does what he came to do. Iroh takes Ba Sing Se. He does this with the Order of the White Lotus, the collection of masters from all four nations who have spent the 100 years of the war existing in the margins, playing pai show and waiting for the moment when what they had preserved in hiding would be needed in the open. The white lotus tile that Iroh kept up his sleeve was never just a game token. It was the means by which the Order recognized itself, the material form of a philosophy that placed the connection between nations above the division between them. When Iroh walks into Ba Sing Se, not as the Dragon of the West, but as the Grand Lotus, not as the general who tried to conquer the city, but as the man who has come to free it, something in him resolves. Something that broke when Lu Ten died on the walls of that city, and he walked away with his armies, and his grief closes. Not cleanly, not without the weight of what it cost, but closed. The finale gives every main character an ending that is proportional to their journey. Aang defeats Ozai without becoming a killer. Zuko takes the Fire Nation throne with the specific authority of someone who has seen both sides of what the throne produces, and has chosen, deliberately and at genuine personal cost, to produce something different. Katara defeats Azula in a fight that requires strategy and patience rather than raw power. A fight where the skills she has developed over 3 seasons of grinding work come together in a demonstration that she has become, by the end of the show, one of the most capable waterbenders alive. Toph destroys the airship fleet with a metal-bending technique that exists because she is exactly who she is, blind and stubborn, and willing to bend the thing everyone else said could not be bent. Sokka commands the operation that brings the fleet down, and the plan he devises is meticulous and effective, and completely characteristic of a person whose intelligence the show has been hiding inside his comedy since episode 1. None of these endings are clean in the sense of being untroubled. Katara's relationship to justice around her mother's death does not resolve. Zuko begins a reign that will require years of careful work to undo what 100 years of the war built. Aang begins the process of rebuilding the air nomad civilization that will extend, we know from the Legend of Korra, into the next generation and beyond. A process that will not be complete in his lifetime. The Southern Water Tribe's waterbenders who were taken by the raids, whose imprisonment and suffering produced Hama and the darkest technique in the show's world, are not mentioned in the finale because there is no resolution available for them that would be proportional to what was taken. The peace that arrives at the end of Avatar, The Last Airbender, is real. It is not a false ending or a dishonest one. The killing stops. The Fire Nation's military occupation of the Earth Kingdom ends. Ozai cannot lead another genocide from his prison cell. These are genuine goods, arrived at through genuine cost, and the show does not diminish them. But it also does not pretend that peace is the same as wholeness. The Earth Kingdom has been occupied and damaged and reshaped by 100 years of war in ways that the end of active combat does not undo. The Southern Water Tribe is still the diminished, depleted place it has been since the raids. The air nomads are still gone, and their going is the specific wound that no amount of peace can restore because the people who were killed cannot be restored. Ba Sing Se is still a city whose political culture was shaped by decades of managed ignorance and institutional brainwashing, and the machinery of that culture does not disappear when the person who operated it is arrested. The final image of the show is Aang and Katara on a balcony, the sun setting behind them over Ba Sing Se, the city that endured. The camera pulls back, slowly, with the specific patience of something that has been holding you close for a long time and is finally willing to let you go. The pullback is not a withdrawal, it is a release. It says, "This is where I leave them. They will be all right." The sun sets in oranges and deep purples that belong to neither the pale winter blues of Book 1 nor the oppressive fire reds of Book 3. Something new, a color that does not have 100 years behind it yet. The world is not healed, it is healing. The difference between those two things is everything. A note on what the darkness is for. There is a question worth sitting with as these words wind down and the night outside does whatever the night does when you are not watching it. Why is Avatar, The Last Airbender, dark in these specific ways? Why did the creators choose to put genocide and child abuse and brainwashing and bloodbending and the psychological destruction of a 14-year-old girl into a cartoon that aired on a children's network between SpongeBob, SquarePants, and the Fairly OddParents? The answer, I think, is not that darkness makes for better stories in some abstract sense, and it is not that the creators wanted to disturb their audience for the sake of the disturbance. The answer is something simpler and more important. They believed that a world at war required honesty about what war is. That the children watching, who were going to grow up into a world with its own versions of all of these things, deserved to encounter them first in the context of a story that took them seriously. That the grief of being the last of your people should feel, in the marrow of it, like what that grief might actually feel like. That the machinery of authoritarianism should be depicted with enough fidelity that a viewer who encountered it in some other form would recognize the shape. The darkness in Avatar is always connected to something real. The air nomad genocide is connected to every historical genocide. The Ba Sing Se propaganda apparatus is connected to every government that has decided the public cannot be trusted with the truth. Hama's bloodbending is connected to the specific logic of people who have survived atrocity and arrived at forms of resistance that perpetuate the structure of the atrocity they escaped. Azula's psychological destruction is connected to what happens when children are treated as instruments rather than people. None of this is decoration. All of it is argument. The argument, taken as a whole, is this. The world contains these things. They are not exceptional. They are the ordinary products of ordinary choices made by ordinary people, operating inside ordinary systems of power. The genocide was committed by a man who believed he was being generous. The brainwashing apparatus was constructed by a man who believed he was maintaining order. The abuse was inflicted by a father who believed he was producing excellence. The darkness is not out there, in monsters. It is in here, in the choices that people make when they have power, and when they decide that what they value justifies what they are willing to do to get it. And the response to all of this, the argument that Avatar makes in answer to its own darkness, is not heroism in the martial sense. It is not the defeat of the darkness by force, though force sometimes has a role. It is something more specific and more demanding. The choice, made by ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, to be something other than what the system around them is producing. Zuko choosing, at genuine personal cost, to be different from his father. Katara choosing, at the moment when she has the power and the justification, not to become what took her mother. Aang choosing, even when every version of wisdom available to him says he cannot afford to be a person who does not kill. These choices are not easy. The show does not depict them as easy. It shows the cost of each one clearly, in the specific weight that every good choice carries in a world that did not need good choices to continue existing in the way it has existed. The world continued for 100 years without Zuko's redemption, without Katara's restraint, without Aang's pacifism. These choices do not resolve the 100 years. They begin something new, in the space that the 100 years left. That is what peace looks like, in Avatar and maybe everywhere, not the end of damage, the beginning of something different. Built in the ruins of what the damage left behind, with full knowledge of the ruins and full commitment to the building anyway. Rest well. You have been here, in the dark of one story and the specific darkness of the world it was honestly depicting, for a long time. The world of Avatar is still there when you wake, with its careful calligraphy and its accurate moon phases, and Iroh's tea and Toph's feet elevated off the ground, and the sound of Aang's airbending slightly softer, slightly more musical than any other benders. It is still there. All of it, the beautiful and the terrible. The 100 years and the sunrise that followed it. Some stories hold you when the night is long. This is one of them. If you made it this far, if the quiet has carried you to somewhere restful, subscribing is how you make sure the next story finds you. It costs nothing. It keeps this going. And if you are watching from somewhere specific, somewhere with a particular hour and a particular kind of dark outside your window, leave it in the comments. I read every one. There is something I cannot fully articulate about knowing that someone in a city I have never visited is here with me in this. Wherever you are, rest well. Extended lore. The nations before the burning. What the world was building before it was taken apart. There is a version of the Avatar world that most viewers never spend time imagining, because the show begins after it is gone. The world before the 100-Year War. The world that was already in the long process of developing something, of accumulating the specific weight of a civilization that has had long enough to build the things that make it worth preserving. It is worth spending time in this imagining, because the loss of it is the engine of everything that follows, and losses are most fully understood when you have some picture of what was there before the losing. The air nomads were not simply a monastic culture that happened to practice a defensive martial art. They were a civilization that had developed, over thousands of years, a philosophy of existence that was genuinely unusual among human civilizations. The concept of non-attachment that organized their spiritual practice was not passivity. It was not the refusal to care about things. It was something more demanding. The capacity to care deeply about the world and the people and the creatures in it without converting that caring into ownership. Without the need for the thing loved to be held, controlled, preserved in a particular form. The air nomads love the world the way you love a river. Not because it stays, but because it moves. And the moving is the thing. This philosophy shaped every aspect of how they lived. Their temples were cliffside structures that you had to earn the approach to, that required physical and spiritual preparation to reach. The architecture itself was a kind of meditation practice. They were vegetarians, not as a dietary preference, but as an extension of the belief that the life of an animal was not something to be taken in service of convenience. They traveled. They did not hold land. The 4 temples were not possessions but anchor points, places to return to between the wandering rather than places to stay. And they were funny. Aang's memories of life at the Southern Air Temple, which the show parcels out across 3 seasons in the form of brief, warm vignettes, are full of laughter. Gyatso cheating at airball games, specifically because he was older and wiser and had more airbending experience than anyone else playing, and then laughing at the offense this caused. Aang and his friends racing through the corridors, the specific silliness of a monastic culture that believed in the lightness of things and expressed that belief in part through a genuine capacity for joy that most serious spiritual traditions are suspicious of. All of that is ash, every piece of it. Every memory Aang has of growing up is a memory of a civilization that exists nowhere except in his body and his mind. The last person who knows what it felt like to wake up in the Southern Air Temple on an ordinary morning, to smell the specific scent of altitude and stone and food being prepared in the kitchens, to hear the particular quality of wind through the corridors that made the temple sound like it was breathing, is a 12-year-old boy who is also the avatar, who does not have the luxury of being only a grieving orphan because the world has other requirements of him. The Southern Water Tribe that Katara and Sokka grow up in is a diminished version of what it was. The show conveys this mostly through implication, through the gap between what Katara knows of the Northern Water Tribe, which retained its population and its waterbenders and its political structure, and what she grew up in, which is a small cluster of tents housing a handful of elderly people and women and children. The Southern Tribe has no waterbending masters. It has almost no waterbenders at all. The raids systematically removed them. Katara's training is done entirely from a stolen scroll, and then from Pakku in the north, because there is no one in her own tribe who can teach her what she is. This is cultural damage of a specific kind that is different from military defeat. Military defeat ends when the fighting stops. Cultural damage is carried forward through generations, in the gap between what people know their tradition to be and what survives of it. Katara knows she is from a waterbending culture. She knows that waterbending is central to who Southern Water Tribe people are, and she is the only one left in her tribe who can actually do it, which means that she is simultaneously the inheritor and the last practitioner, carrying a tradition forward without the context that would tell her what she is supposed to be carrying. The Earth Kingdom before the war was a continental civilization that had developed, over centuries, a culture of endurance and patience and the specific stubbornness of a people who live in and with the earth. Earthbenders who stand their ground, because standing your ground is the entire philosophy of the element. Farmers and miners and builders who understood that the most important things take the longest to grow, and who built accordingly. The walls of Ba Sing Se are the most visible expression of this culture, but they are not the only one. They are just the one that survived, that proved its own logic, that stood when everything around it was being systematically dismantled. The Fire Nation before Sozin was also building something. This is the thing the 100 years erased in the Fire Nation as surely as it erased the Air Nomads, though more quietly, through the corruption of a culture rather than its elimination. The Fire Nation had art and music and architecture and a relationship with its element that the show, in Book 3's embedded episode about Aang going undercover in a Fire Nation school, shows you the ghost of. The students are not allowed to dance. They are not allowed to create art about unapproved subjects. Their history is taught to them as a story of benevolent expansion rather than violent conquest. Everything in the culture that was not useful to the war machine, everything that expressed the Fire Nation's specific beauty and creativity, was suppressed in the service of producing a population that could sustain a 100-year military campaign without questioning it. The Fire Nation citizens in Book 3, the ordinary people that Aang encounters when he goes undercover, are not villains. They are people who were told a story about who they were and what their nation was doing, and the story was told so consistently and from so early in their lives that most of them have no mechanism for questioning it. The propaganda did not produce monsters. It produced people who believe sincerely that they live in a nation doing a good thing, and who have never been given the information that would allow them to believe otherwise. This is what 100 years of war does to the nation doing the waging of it. It does not just damage the nations being conquered. It damages the conquering nation from the inside, hollowing out everything in the culture that does not serve the conquest, replacing it with a story about the conquest being necessary and good, and a gift to the people on the receiving end of it. The Fire Nation at the end of the 100 years is not the Fire Nation that existed at its beginning. It has been reshaped by the war as thoroughly as anyone it fought. The world that Aang wakes into is a world of losses, so layered that the show can spend 3 seasons examining them and still not reach the bottom. Every nation has been deformed by the 100 years in ways that will take generations to address. The restoration of balance that the Avatar's mission calls for is not something that can be accomplished in a single campaign. It is a project for the rest of the lives of everyone who survives to the end of the show, and for the generations after them. And this is, perhaps, the darkest thing of all, that the work is not done when the war ends. The war's ending is the end of one phase and the beginning of another, longer, quieter, more difficult phase in which the damage is repaired from the inside and the truth is restored, where the lie was installed and the things that were taken. The cultures and the languages and the practices and the specific knowledge that lives only in the people who carry it are either recovered imperfectly or mourned permanently. Aang begins this work in the finale and continues it for the rest of his life. He builds the Air Acolytes, a group of people from all 4 nations who commit themselves to studying and preserving the air nomad traditions that survive. He finds the Sky Bison, including Appa's descendants, who are alive somewhere, who survived the attacks on the temples and have been living in the wild. He teaches what he remembers, and records what he teaches, and builds the scaffolding for a culture that will need another generation to truly live rather than simply be performed. The second generation of airbenders, born through the harmonic convergence that happens in the Legend of Korra, are the delayed fruit of this work. Aang's lifetime of effort, the effort of a person who spent 61 episodes carrying a grief too large for any individual, produces a world in which the element is not lost, in which the air nomads are not the last chapter, in which the story can continue. This is not healing. Not exactly. It is something more humble and more honest than healing. It is continuation. It is the choice to build something in the space where the loss was, not because the building replaces the loss or makes the loss smaller, but because the building is the only thing available to you, and because the world needs what you can build more than it needs your grief to be completed on any particular timeline. Extended lore, the real people behind the darkness, historical parallels the show draws without naming them. Avatar, The Last Airbender never makes its historical parallels explicit. It does not draw a diagram connecting the air nomad genocide to historical genocides you may have studied. It does not announce that the Fire Nation's industrial military complex is drawing from the same logic as imperialist Japan or colonial European powers. It does not put a footnote on the brainwashing scene explaining which historical models it drew from. It trusts you to feel the shape of the familiar in the unfamiliar, to recognize the pattern without being told what to call it. But the patterns are there, and they are not accidental, and understanding them makes the darkness of Avatar legible in a way that purely fictional analysis cannot. The systematic targeting of waterbenders in the Southern Water Tribe, the specifically designed program of identifying and removing people with a particular cultural or spiritual identity over a period of years, until the community is stripped of the element that holds it together, has a shape that repeats in the historical record with depressing consistency. Indigenous people in multiple continents have experienced versions of this, the targeted removal of cultural practitioners, of language keepers, of people who carry in their bodies and their memories the specific knowledge that a culture needs to reproduce itself. The goal is not always the same as in the raids. Sometimes the goal is assimilation, sometimes displacement, sometimes something more final. But the mechanism is recognizable. Remove the people who know how to pass the thing down. The thing dies with them. The Ba Sing Se propaganda apparatus, the There Is No War in Ba Sing Se program maintained by the Dai Li and Longfeng, draws from the well-documented practices of authoritarian states that manage populations through information control. The show's creators have said they researched coercive persuasion techniques for the brainwashing scenes. What they found, and what they adapted, was not science fiction. It was methodology that had been developed and deployed in real historical contexts in which the systematic repetition of counterfactual narratives under conditions of stress and isolation can produce genuine belief in things that are not true. The repetition of the phrase "while the lantern swings in the darkness" is not a fantasy sequence. It is a functional description of how induced belief states work. The Fire Nation's education system, shown in Book 3's Headband episode, is the mirror image of this. Where Ba Sing Se controls its population through the suppression of information, the Fire Nation controls its population through the injection of particular information, the story of a benevolent nation bringing civilization to people who need it, taught to children who have no access to any competing narrative. The history the Fire Nation children learn in school is not recognizable as the history the audience has been watching for 2 seasons, because it is the history as seen from inside the ideology of the people doing the conquering. Every empire, in every era of actual history, has had a version of this story that it told to its own children about what it was doing in the world and why. Hama's bloodbending is not just a dark plot development. It is a portrait of something specific and historically documented. The way that protracted imprisonment and systematic torture can transform people who began as ordinary human beings into people capable of extraordinary cruelty, and the way that the cruelty they develop mirrors the cruelty that was done to them, because that is the only cruelty they have an intimate enough understanding of to deploy. Hama was not born to bloodbend civilians. She was made capable of it by years of imprisonment designed to strip her of everything except the survival instinct. And the survival instinct, once it is the only thing left, will find a way. The way it finds is shaped by the shape of the suffering that produced it. Sozin's use of the comet as an amplification event, the deliberate timing of the genocide to coincide with a naturally occurring phenomenon that would make his military vastly more powerful than it would otherwise have been, has a structural parallel to the way that real historical acts of mass violence have been timed to conditions of maximum advantage, not necessarily comets, but windows of reduced resistance, moments of transition, natural disasters, political upheavals that stripped communities of their normal means of defense and collective organization. The genocide of the air nomads was planned to occur when the conditions for resisting it were at their worst, and when the Fire Nation's capacity for carrying it out was at its peak. This is not the logic of monsters. It is the logic of military planning, applied to the elimination of an entire civilization. Understanding these parallels does not make the darkness of Avatar heavier. It makes it legible. It explains why the show feels true even though it is fantasy, why the things that happen in it produce something in the viewer that goes beyond the ordinary response to fictional violence. The viewer recognizes these patterns, even without being able to name them, because the patterns are real. They belong to the actual world, and the show has imported them into its fictional world with enough fidelity that the recognition is unavoidable. This is what great fantasy does. Not escapism from the real world, but a kind of portable version of it. A world constructed enough like ours that the things in it are familiar but different enough that they can be seen more clearly than they can be seen in the historical record, which is always mediated by politics and distance and the specific difficulty of looking directly at things that are too close. Avatar lets you look, from a safe distance, through the eyes of children who are also navigating all of it for the first time, with the benefit of a century of hindsight that real people living inside historical atrocities never have. It is a gift, delivered in the form of a cartoon, to everyone who needs to understand something about how worlds fall apart and how, sometimes, they begin to be rebuilt. A final word before sleep. There is a philosopher named Simone Weil who wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She meant that to truly see something, to give it the full weight of your awareness rather than the partial, distracted glance that most things receive from us most of the time, is itself an act of love. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that says, "This is worth my time. This matters enough to be seen clearly." The people who made Avatar, The Last Airbender, paid this kind of attention to their world. They paid it to the genocide and to what the genocide cost the boy who survived it. They paid it to the psychology of a girl who was shaped from childhood into a weapon and who fell apart when the purpose the weapon was built for was removed. They paid it to the old woman in the innkeeper's apron who was not what she appeared to be, who had made something terrible out of something that was done to her, who smiled at Katara across a breakfast table with genuine warmth and genuine grief and genuine darkness, all three at once, because people are capable of being all three at once. They paid attention to Iroh's grief, to the specific sound of a man singing to his dead son in a language that most viewers do not understand, in a moment that the show constructs with such care that it does not matter whether you understand the words. The grief is in the music. It is in the voice actor's knowledge that he was dying, whether or not he knew it was his last recording. It is in the dedication that ran at the end of the episode 2 months after the man who performed it was gone. And they paid attention to Zuko, to the camera's choice, episode by episode, of which side of his face to show you. To the way the scarred side and the unscarred side are not just aesthetic choices but information, are the show's visual language for which version of a person is present in any given moment. They paid attention to this across 3 seasons and dozens of episodes, in every frame where Zuko appeared, because they understood that the most important things are always in the details that most people do not consciously notice. This is what the darkness of Avatar teaches, if it teaches anything. That attention is not separate from love. That the care you bring to depicting difficult things, the refusal to simplify them or sanitize them or rush through them toward a cleaner resolution, is a form of respect for the people who have experienced versions of those things in the actual world. That a story about a genocide is also always, if it is made with this kind of attention, a story about the actual historical genocides that inspired it. And that telling the story with honesty is itself an act of witness, a refusal to let the thing be reduced to something more comfortable than it was. The world of Avatar. The Last Airbender is still there, still holding its darkness and its warmth in the same frame, the way the actual world holds them. Still waiting for the next time you return to it, with whatever understanding you bring that you did not bring the last time. It will give you something you have not found before. It always does. The calligraphy is real. The moon is tracking correctly across the nighttime sky of 61 episodes. Iroh is making tea somewhere in Ba Sing Se, in the Jasmine Dragon, on a morning that came after the longest night. And the sun is rising over a world that is not healed but is healing, that is not whole but is rebuilding, that has earned the specific imperfect piece of something that decided to continue. Rest now. You have been here long enough to have earned the rest. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever the particular darkness is outside your window tonight, I hope this carried you somewhere quieter, somewhere a little closer to the edge of sleep. Good night.